The narcissist you walked away from is on the verge of a breakdown, and I want to start by being honest about something that most content on this topic is not honest about, which is that the word breakdown in this title is not being used the way breakdown is used when we talk about people whose psychology has a different structure than the narcissists. A breakdown in the ordinary sense, the kind that arrives when a person's defenses against their own pain finally fail completely and the unprocessed emotional reality floods the conscious experience in a way that temporarily overwhelms functioning. That kind of breakdown is not quite what is happening in the narcissist whose system is approaching the threshold. What is happening is related to that, but is structurally different in ways that matter for understanding what it actually looks like and what it actually means. The narcissist's approaching breakdown is better understood as a structural failure, not of the person but of the construction, of the false self and the supply system and the narrative control and the management mechanisms that the construction depends on for its continued functioning. When those mechanisms begin failing simultaneously, when the supply is insufficient and the D-narrative is contested and the management tools are producing diminishing returns, and the person who was the most significant recent source of the non-fungible supply that cannot be replaced by new acquisition is gone and showing evidence of doing genuinely better in the absence, when all of those things are happening at once, which is the specific set of circumstances that your walking away and your subsequent thriving produces, the construction is under a kind of simultaneous pressure from multiple directions that it was not designed to withstand. And what it does under that pressure is not what a healthy psychology does under pressure. It does not integrate, does not process, does not produce the genuine reckoning that the pressure might seem to be pointing toward. It strains. And the straining, before it either stabilizes or produces the structural failure that the breakdown actually is, produces a specific sequence of behavioral and psychological breaks migraines that are recognizable once you have the framework to see them, and that are the evidence the title is pointing at when it says on the verge. So stay with me, because what we are about to walk through is the most complete account available of what is actually happening in the narcissist you walked away from in the specific period when the constructions simultaneous pressures are approaching the threshold that the breakdown represents. Let's start with what your walking away actually did to the construction's functioning, because the breakdown does not begin in the moment you left. It begins in the specific period after the leaving, when the consequences of the leaving start accumulating in ways the construction was not prepared to manage simultaneously. In the immediate aftermath of your departure, the construction's standard responses activated efficiently and as expected. The replacement seeking began. The narrative was assembled, the version of the ending that positions the narcissist favorably, that explains your departure in terms that do not implicate the construction behavior as the primary cause, that converts the loss into something that was either chosen or deserved, or simply the natural conclusion of a relationship that had run its course. The social visibility increased to demonstrate the forward motion that the construction requires as evidence of its own continued significance and desirability. All of this happened on schedule, with the efficiency that the construction has always brought to the management of endings, and in the early period it appeared, from any available external vantage point, to be working. The narcissist was fine. The narcissist was visibly moving forward. The narcissist was demonstrating, through the conspicuous forward motion and the new supply and the assembled narrative, that the loss had been processed and filed and was no longer requiring significant management resources. This appearance of efficient management is the construction first response to your walking away. It is not evidence that the walking away did not matter. It is evidence that the construction is doing its job. For now, the simultaneous pressures begin accumulating underneath the efficient management, in the places the management cannot reach. The first pressure is the supply gap, not the obvious supply gap that the replacement seeking is designed to address. The admiration, the attention, the confirmation of the presented self that new supply reliably provides at the beginning of its cycle. The replacement seeking addresses that gap efficiently, and the new supply's early stage Enthusiasm covers most of what the gap produced in the immediate aftermath of your departure. The pressure is the non-fungible gap, the specific, replacement-resistant absence of what you provided that was not the admiration of the construction, but the perception of what was underneath it. The actual self, reached by your specific quality of knowing, has no adequate substitute in the new supply, and the inadequacy is not experienced as loss, consciously, but as the background flatness we have discussed in previous conversations. The low-grade insufficiency of supply that is providing everything supply has always provided, except the specific thing that your supply uniquely provided. This pressure does not announce itself. It accumulates. It is present in the slight additional effort required to maintain the new relationship, say enthusiasm, in the slightly shorter satisfaction cycle that the new supply produces. In the quality of the private moments, when the new supply is not actively engaged, and the background, flatness is the only thing present. The construction manages this pressure by increasing supply-seeking intensity, more social engagement, more visible forward motion, more conspicuous demonstration of a full and thriving life. The management requires more resources than it used to require, and the increased resource demand is the first indication that the management is working harder than it should need to work. The second pressure arrives from the narrative, specifically from the narrative's increasing difficulty maintaining its coherence in the moods, presence of evidence that contradicts it. The narrative that was assembled in the immediate aftermath of your departure told a specific story. You were the problem, or the relationship was simply not the right fit, or the ending was mutual and appropriate, or some combination of these, that positioned the narcissist as the reasonable party, in a conclusion that was not primarily their responsibility. This narrative circulated in the shared social world, was delivered to the available audience with conviction, was maintained with the specific efficiency that the construction brings to narrative management. And then something started happening to the narrative that the construction had not adequately prepared for. You started doing better. The visible evidence of your improved well-being, the specific quality of your presence in your own life, the increased aliveness, the fuller expression of yourself that the relationship's four requirements had been suppressing, began reaching the narcissist's monitoring system with a consistency and a specificity that the narrative was not equipped to incorporate without. Because the narrative said the ending was appropriate. The narrative said you were not significantly damaged by what happened, or that whatever damage occurred was the natural consequence of a relationship that was mutually difficult. But your visible thriving, your specific and undeniable doing better in the relationship's absence, is telling a different story. A story in which the relationship was not simply a neutral fit mismatch, but something that was specifically and measurably constraining you. A story in which your better without the narcissist is direct, observable evidence about what the relationship was and what the narcissist role in it actually was. The narrative must work increasingly hard to incorporate this evidence without being dismantled by it, and the increasing work required to maintain the narrative against the accumulating contradictory evidence is the second simultaneous pressure. Not a single threatening piece of information, but a continuous, accumulating stream of it, each piece requiring its own management effort, the aggregate requiring more management than the construction available resources were calibrated to provide. The third pressure is the one that arrives most quietly and produces the most specifically destabilizing effect, because it does not arrive from outside the construction at all. It arrives from inside it, from the actual self, the one that was reached by your knowing, the one that was present in the windows when the construction stepped back, the one that has been carrying the unprocessed awareness of what was received and what was done with what was received ever since the relationship ended. The actual self's pressure is not the pressure of guilt in the full conscious sense. It is the pressure of the knowing that the construction cannot entirely suppress, because the knowing is not organized at the level the construction's suppression mechanisms operate at. It is more primitive than that, more bodily, more specifically present in the moments when the construction's management of everything else requires enough resources that the management of the actual self, knowing, is temporarily underfunded. And in those moments of underfunding, the knowing surfaces, not as a clearly identified, articulable awareness of having done something wrong, as the quality we have discussed before, the sourceless discomfort, the specific wrongness of certain silences, the low-grade but persistent presence of something that the forward motion and the new supply and the narrative management are all, at some level, organized around preventing from becoming fully conscious. The actual self knows what it lost. It knows what it was responsible for losing, and the knowledge, surfacing in the underfunded moments, is the third simultaneous pressure. And three simultaneous pressures: the supply gap that the replacement cannot fill, the narrative that the evidence is increasingly contradicting, and the actual self's knowledge surfacing in the moments the management cannot reach. Three simultaneous pressures on a construction that was designed to manage one thing at a time is the specific architecture of what the Verge actually is, and what the construction does as the pressures compound, and the specific behavioral expressions that the compounding produces that are visible to anyone who knows what to look for, and why the Verge is not the breakdown, and what actually tips the construction from the Verge into the failure. That is exactly where we are going next. What the construction does, as the three pressures compound, is something that follows a specific and recognizable sequence. And understanding the sequence is what allows you to read the narcissist's behavior in this period accurately, rather than through the lens of the narrative the narcissist is simultaneously trying to maintain. Because the behaviors that the compounding pressures produce do not present themselves as evidence of strain. They present themselves as the opposite, as evidence of continued functioning, continued forward motion, continued management of the situation, with the efficiency that the construction has always brought to difficult circumstances. But the specific quality of the behaviors, once you have the framework to read them accurately, is different from the quality of the same behaviors when they were produced from a position of genuine construction stability. They have a quality of effort in them that the stable versions do not have, a quality of someone working slightly harder than the situation should require to produce responses that used to arrive automatically, and that effort, perceptible in the overperformance, in the slightly too enthusiastic demonstration of fineness, in the specific quality of someone managing rather than simply being, is the Verge made behavioral. It is the constructions, as strain, becoming visible in the places where the management is most stretched. The first behavioral expression of the compounding pressures is the escalation of the conspicuous thriving performance, not the ordinary forward motion that the construction produces in the immediate aftermath of any significant ending, but something more specifically overdone, a quality of the public-facing thriving that exceeds what the circumstances would require from a person who was genuinely thriving. The new relationship is displayed with an enthusiasm that is slightly too deliberate to read as the natural expression of genuine enjoyment. The social media presence increases in frequency and in the specific quality of its content. More evidence of a full life, more demonstrations of continued significance, more markers of a person who is doing well in ways that are specifically calibrated to reach the awareness of anyone who might be monitoring. The social visibility expands into contexts that the narcissist's pre-breakdown behavior did not typically include, as though the audience for the thriving performance has been identified as insufficient and requires expansion. All of this is recognizable as the construction's response to the supply gap and the narrative pressure simultaneously. It is the attempt to generate supply from the performance of thriving, while also reinforcing the narrative that the ending was appropriate, and that the narcissist's subsequent life is evidence of the appropriateness. But the specific quality of the overperformance, the degree to which it exceeds what genuine thriving would require, is the evidence of the strain underneath it. Genuine thriving does not require this level of demonstration. Only thriving that is being managed into existence for an audience requires this level of demonstration. And the audience, at this stage of the Verge, is primarily you, or rather, the monitoring systems, is model of what is reaching you and what the information reaching you is producing. The second behavioral expression is the one that most people who observe it from any proximity find most confusing and most difficult to interpret accurately, because it does not fit easily. into either the narrative that the narcissist is performing or the supply-seeking framework that explains most of the narcissist's behavior. It is the sudden, seemingly unprompted engagement with themes of self-reflection, the conversations about personal growth, the apparent interest in understanding past behavior, the specific quality of someone who appears to be examining themselves in ways they did not previously appear willing to examine themselves. This can manifest in direct conversations with people in the narcissist's orbit, in the content they engage with publicly, in the way they describe themselves and their history in social contexts. And the confusion it produces is understandable, because the content of the self-reflection is not entirely without genuine material. The actual self's pressure, surfacing in the underfunded moments of the construction's management, is providing some genuine access to territory that the construction usually prevents from being examined. The self-reflection is not entirely performed. There is something real underneath it, something that the compounding pressures have made temporarily more accessible than it usually is. But the self-reflection is also not what it presents itself as being. It is not the beginning of the genuine, sustained, professionally supported engagement with the actual self, psychology that genuine change would require. It is the construction's incorporation of the self-reflection's appearance as a new supply-generating presentation. The apparent vulnerability, the apparent willingness to examine difficult things, is being deployed in the specific register that the construction has identified as producing supply in way to current circumstances, the circumstances in which the straightforward performance of confident forward motion is producing less supply than it used to, requiring the construction to find new supply-generating presentations that the changed landscape will respond to more productively. The self-reflection is the new presentation, and the people in the narcissist orbit who respond to it with the encouragement and the hope that it represents genuine change are providing exactly the supply the presentation was designed to generate. The third behavioral expression arrives when the first two are not producing sufficient supply to manage the compounding pressures, when the escalated thriving performance is generating some supply but not enough to cover the non-fungible gap, and when the self-reflection presentation is generating some supply but not enough to address the actual self's pressure, and when the narrative is continuing to require more maintenance than the available resources are comfortably providing. The third behavioral expression is the most revealing of the three, and the one that most specifically indicates the proximity to the Verge's tipping point. It is the disproportionate response, the reaction to something relatively ordinary that carries more emotional charge than the ordinary something would warrant if the construction were operating from a position of genuine stability, a minor social slight that produces a response calibrated for a significant threat, a small challenge to the narrative that produces a defensive intensity that belongs to a much larger challenge, a brief encounter with information about your current life that produces a behavioral response whose magnitude reveals how much is being managed underneath the surface that the response was supposed to belong to the surface of. The disproportionate response is the construction's management capacity being exceeded at a specific point by a specific input that arrives when the available resources are already fully allocated to managing the three compounding pressures. It is the system at capacity being asked to process one more thing and producing a response that reveals the capacity constraint rather than the ordinary, well-managed response that the fully resourced system would produce. And the disproportionate response is important not just as evidence of the Verge, but as evidence of something more specific. It is evidence of where the sensitivity is greatest, of which specific inputs are arriving in the territory that the three pressures have made most exposed. And that territory, identified by the disproportionate response, is always the same territory. It is the territory of the actual self's knowledge, and the narrative's vulnerability, and the non-fungible supply gap. The things that produce the disproportionate response are always, in some form, the things that touch those three territories. And the disproportionate quality of the response is the construction's acknowledgement, made visible despite itself, that those territories are not as well managed as the surface performance suggests. Now let's talk about what actually tips the construction from the Verge into the structural failure. the specific threshold that the compounding pressures and the behavioral expressions and the disproportionate responses are building toward. Because the verge is not indefinite, it has a specific resolution, and the resolution goes in one of two directions that are worth understanding clearly, because they produce completely different subsequent dynamics and completely different implications for the person who walked away and is watching from whatever distance. The first direction is stabilization. The construction finds new supply sources sufficient to reduce the non-fungible gap below the threshold of acute pressure. The narrative finds new material or new contexts in which the contradicting evidence is less available or less damaging. The actual self's pressure is resuppressed by the management mechanisms as they recover their resource availability. The construction returns to something that resembles its pre-verge functioning, not unchanged, because the verge always leaves something slightly different in the construction's internal landscape, but functional. Stable in the specific sense of the management mechanisms being sufficient to keep the pressures below the acute threshold. This is the more common of the two directions. Most narcissists stabilize. Most constructions, put under the specific pressure that your walking away and subsequent thriving produces, find enough new supply and enough narrative maintenance and enough actual self-suppression to pull back from the verge without completing the structural failure. And the stabilization produces a specific behavioral shift that is observable if you know what to look for: a return to the ordinary supply-seeking efficiency, a reduction in the overperformance quality of the thriving display, a quieting of the disproportionate responses as the available management resources are no longer at capacity. The verge is over. The construction has held. The breakdown in this direction does not occur. And understanding that this is the more common direction is important for the person who has been watching the verge's behavioral expressions with the hope or the expectation that a breakdown is inevitable, because the breakdown is not inevitable, and the hope organized around its inevitability is a hope that is organized around the narcissist rather than around the life that the walking away was supposed to be making space for. The second direction is the structural failure, and it occurs when the stabilization mechanisms are insufficient, when the new supply cannot adequately address the non-fungible gap, when the narrative cannot maintain coherence against the accumulating contradicting evidence, when the actual self-pressure cannot be resuppressed to the level that the management requires, and when these three insufficiencies compound each other rather than being manageable independently. The structural failure does not look like the dramatic, public, visibly obvious collapse that the word breakdown tends to suggest. It looks, from the outside, like a series of increasingly significant departures from the construction's ordinary functioning. The supply seeking becomes less efficient, less calibrated, less organized around the specific targeting that the construction's careful assessment of supply sources usually produces. The narrative becomes less consistent, more easily challenged, less smoothly delivered, with the conviction that genuine belief in it would produce. The disproportionate responses become more frequent and less quickly corrected, leaving more visible residue in the social world that the construction would ordinarily have managed before it became visible. And in the private moments, the actual self's pressure is no longer being adequately suppressed. It is present with a consistency and a force that the management reduced capacity cannot contain, and the uncontained pressure produces the closest thing to genuine psychological distress that the narcissist's architecture permits. Not the clean, fully conscious, specifically organized distress of someone with full access to their own interior life, but the fragmented, defended, incompletely managed version of it that the actual self can produce when the construction, suppression mechanisms are underfunded. And that version, as incomplete and as defended as it is the breakdown, not the dramatic public collapse. The private, persistent, management insufficient experience of everything that construction was built to prevent from being consciously present. The wound, the knowing, the gap between what was received and what was done with what was received. The specific loss of the one witness the actual self has ever had. All of it present at once in the private moments, managed inadequately by a construction that, has reached the limit of what 3 simultaneous compounding pressures have left it able to manage. That is the breakdown. And what it means for you, the person who walked away, who is watching this from the distance that the walking away created, who may be experiencing the breakdown's behavioral expressions in the shared social world or hearing about them through the channels that still connect your lives. What it means for you is the most important thing this episode has been building toward. It does not mean you should go back. It does not mean the breakdown is evidence of the change that would make going back produce something different. It does not mean the suffering, genuine as it is in the private moments, has been sufficient, or is sufficient, or will automatically become sufficient to produce the reckoning that genuine change requires. What it means is simpler and more important than any of those things. It means you were right. What you knew about the relationship, what you felt about what it was costing you, what you understood about the dynamic that made leaving the necessary choice, all of it was accurate. And the breakdown is the construction's structural acknowledgement of that accuracy. The most honest thing the narcissist's psychology produces. Not offered as an acknowledgement. Not organized as an apology. Not available as the closure that would make the leaving feel complete in the way that genuine accountability from the person who did the harm would make it feel complete. But present. Real. Specific. In the private moments of someone whose construction is failing under the weight of what your absence and your thriving have made undeniable. And that presence, the reality of it, the accuracy it confirms, the specific validation it provides for everything you knew and everything you chose, belongs to you, not as triumph, not as the satisfaction of a wrong being righted, as the quiet, complete, finally arrived confirmation that the clarity you left with was real, and the life you are building in the space the leaving created is the only place that confirmation actually needs to land.